I'm more worried actually by another kind of move, which again comes directly from these insoluble dilemmas that people are faced with, that too little is moving as a society, too little is changing, and so parents are faced with impossible tasks of answering the ethic of care on the one hand and the work ethic on the other. But here's another way out. One columnist, in response to that article in the New York Times, talked about the liberating, bracing effects of thinking about bad mothers. They gave us hope, she said. Doris Lessing, the writer, who so bravely abandoned her children in South Africa while she went off to write all the novels we love. But she was drawing on a French philosopher, Elizabeth Badinter, who has recently decried all those French policies I was arguing were so beneficial earlier. She said that's making mothers enslaved by their children. Years of breastfeeding. You know, I think her vision was something like, have you all seen Little Britain? The moment where he's still breastfeeding at 35? Yeah. I think her vision was something like that. All that washing of environmentally sound nappies rather than disposable nappies. And she'd written about this earlier in a book on the myth of motherhood, where she had looked at the way mothering and, by implication, fathering has changed over history, and how grisly it was in what I've now come to call the good old days. So I have a very large file now called The Good Old Days. And I have to say I have as much sympathy for this genre as I do when I hear men waxing about the lyrical about the good old days before women's rights. And of course, we as women can speak up and decry those notions, but children lack a voice. So here's just a couple of examples, and they're quite widespread. We had a pamphlet done for the Australian Institute of Family Studies, and it quotes approvingly of some eminent researchers, Michael Lamb and Kathleen Sternberg. Last time I looked, Michael Lamb was at Oxford, a very eminent person. And what they said was, and I'm quoting, it was about all the dilemmas of trying to provide decent childcare for children. They said, it is not unreasonable to emphasise custodial aspects of care designed largely to ensure survival until the age of reason, which is about the age of 6 or 7. And differing belief systems, as they pointed to other apparently more enlightened societies than our own who are continually getting our knickers in a twist over the quality of childcare, it has major implications for childcare and the seriousness of our concerns even over the quality of care. Well, that sure lowers the bar. A custodial sentence normally means prison. What is meant by care just good enough, I'd like to know, to ensure survival? Does that mean tying a small child to a carpet weaver's loom? Does that mean the kind of care that girl children have got throughout Asia? I recently wrote a piece on what's called gendercide, and there's a systematic, has been historically and even in the present, systematic withholding of resources to female children because they are less valued. Now, I don't think for a minute that these well-heeled sociologists are actually thinking through what they're saying. They're really simply responding to the fact that they see very little movement on the kind of reforms that we actually need. But they're not alone. Here's another one. She wrote a bestseller called The Nurture Assumption, Judith Rich Harris. And she says, child rearing is easier when it's done without guilt. Of course it is. She says it's easier on the parent. And she quotes a sociologist who tells that in the good old days, children were liable to be neglected, abused and ill-treated without anyone thinking there were questions to be raised and without anyone having a guilty conscience about it. I'd like to just substitute the word woman in there. Women were able to be neglected, abused and ill-treated without anyone thinking there were questions to be raised and without anyone having a guilty conscience about it. Then there's an economist, famous economist, Juliet Shaw. She says, children were hardly raised in today's sense of the term. For the most part, children were not cared for by parents. The rich had little to do with their offspring until they were grown. Infants were sent to wet nurses, despite the fact they had markedly lower rates of survival. Older children were sent off to school. And that's just for the wealthy. For the poor, well, they could be drugged with opium. The young uns all lay about the floor, said one woman for the 19th century, like dead uns. And there's no bother with them. So forget sleep training and controlled crying, just ring your dealer. Then she goes on to say, however harmful these practices may have been for children, they were convenient for their elders. She does concede, however, one fact. Rising standards of mothering were responsible for dramatically improving child survival rates, happiness and well-being amongst children. Now, if we are to think about children through this great transition that we are going through, enormous changes in the rates of both men and women working, huge opportunities of a kind that I'm just delighted to see for my daughters. Nonetheless, there is one thing that I'm a stickler for, and that is I want to carry children with us. I want children to come with us into a world that is better. And I should point out that since the 1960s, we have actually been arguing the exact opposite of this good old days kind of genre. We've been actually saying for blacks, for ethnic groups regarded formerly as inferior, for women. For those groups, we want a radical break with what has been always argued to be natural. We say instead, we have not from the past what has always been the case, but rather we want treatment that is just. And so it seems to me that children should be a part of that kind of outlook on the world, those kinds of values. And parents, of course, are caught in another modern conundrum. At the same time as the time available is so much less, we have the early years mantra being chanted by every government official around the world. There's a kind of tightening of the grip around what apparently we're meant to do in order to be good parents. Reading a lot of that material, though, in the end I took heart, especially for one book's title. From all the work on early childhood, all the work in neuroscience, all the work in early attachment, there was a book, by a British psychotherapist, and it has a really good summary of all of this material about the sort of condition that make children flourish. And it's simply entitled, Why Love Matters. Why Love Matters. And we might well ask why we need the full armoury of a technologically advanced civilization, those disciplines known as neuroscience, bearing down on us to convince us that love matters. But hey. And the essential message really is simply about the relational world the child inhabits, that a child might be enjoyed, about children developing connected selves with others, forming strong relationships in a neighbourhood and a family, that a child's cognitive potential, how they do at school, is actually really based fundamentally, the most prior, important thing is what they call emotional regulation, or the ability simply to control themselves, to calm themselves down, to lift their mood, to control aggression. And then actually the entirety of this literature, which I think could well be seen as a noose, yet another noose tightening around the good mother's neck, nonetheless is actually saying something very simple, profound but simple. But the distorted version, again, coming from our society, translates what might be a partnership between a childcare centre and a parent. It might be between the parents, it might be a mother at home, it could be a stay-at-home dad, it could be grandma, it could be all of these people come together, the quality of those relationships. Here's what an official addressing the World Bank said on early institutional childcare. All this material about the way children flourish in early childhood became early institutional childcare. And there appeared to be a benefit. For $1 invested, a figure that's often bandied around, there was $7 returned. But then he said, all the research has demonstrated the economic importance of early care and education, the economic contributions made by early childhood services, investments in human development and education. The regional economy has helped. Investments in childcare as an industry that produces jobs and stimulates the economy. The third element represents parents, the economic contributions they make to the economy as employees and consumers. The economic contributions of the children are considered long-term because the payoff largely occurs after the child matures. So the word economic appears 4 times, economy thrice, and so on. It's all the language of economics. And of course, it does help for children to be well treated. It does help if they do well at school. But in this analysis, the word love appears nowhere. Parents are redefined as employees and consumers. And the value we place on children's well-being, their experience at the time, has disappeared. It's all about they're an investment unit bringing returns later on. So, when you get to the fork in the road, Yogi Bear says, you take it. It's important that we realise that a great deal of the tension between mothers over the question of guilt and what constitutes a good mother is due to the privatisation of those tensions, making things personal, often heatedly personal, rather than looking at the ways in which they can be resolved politically. Market calculus has its place in the marketplace. But somehow we're going to have to resist the colonisation of the private realm by these utterly diminished judgments of the human, thinking about matters to do with children, which are to do with love, joy, pain, intimacy, all those unquantifiable aspects of the human condition, and looking at them through the lens of a vulgar utilitarianism. Because if the people on the receiving end are human beings, and they are, just smaller, if we are worth it, then surely children are too.
Come and sit down. Okay, we have about 15 minutes for questions. There are microphones on either side. So if people would like to ask a question, if you just queue on the side and we'll get through as many as we can. We had a conversation before about the place of childlessness in these debates, about where childlessness fits and the choice not to have children in relation to these ideas about whether children are worth it or not.
Yes. As well as being a passionate advocate for child well-being, I'm also, it may seem paradoxical, but passionately of the view that there's tremendous bigotry towards the childless, and that people have to be able to make decisions that they are not having children without it being thought that they are selfish. And in fact, one of the examples of this is the kind of acrimony which was directed at Julia Gillard during the election campaign over her childlessness. And it struck me, I don't know a lot about her life, but having watched her speak, I thought very movingly about her sister, who has centred her life on children. There's sort of 2 sisters, one who's a career person and one who's much more oriented to a life with children on Australian Story, that she actually spoke very well about the importance of children, and that what she was really saying was that children are worth it. And I think many childless people do actually make this decision, that because children are worth it, they can't feel, they don't feel in their lives that they can actually give that time and energy to children. So they're saying children require certain things and they don't believe that they can, given the sort of lives they want to lead. And I think that should be one of the great welcomed freedoms I was speaking about Doris Lessing in my talk, and you have to think that she actually was of an era where motherhood was more or less compulsory. So the kind of role that she took to, when in the end, walking out on her family and small children and going to England, was a part of this world where she had very few options open to her. So I think the kind of hostility that sometimes the childless express towards those with children, demanding, calling it child-free rather than childless and so on, is a kind of defensive move because it is assumed that children have to be a part of the good life. And I would vigorously argue for them being a part of a good life, but not being the only way that you can express altruism, that you can express dedication to others, that you can have a pro-social life or a good life. And indeed, many of my intellectual role models were childless women, and they made that call. And interestingly, they always put it in terms of that children would require this, and I do not feel I can give that. So,
okay, thanks. We have a question over here.
In the election, there was one topic that wasn't mentioned, and Adele Horian of the Sydney Morning Herald said it was a good thing that it wasn't mentioned. But that was about what's happening in the family court. What's happening to children is quite horrible. And if, people think that it's a worry being a mother or a father, just try going through the family court process and try some of the consenting orders that you have to fulfill. It's absolutely impossible for the children and for the parent. And the human rights of children are nowhere in the family court system. So, I just wanted to get that across, even though I'm not expressing it very well.
Okay, thanks.
Yes, I think certainly with moves towards shared care, we have to think about the rights of children very carefully. And in some ways, there are all kinds of instances of men being deprived of time with children. And, I would take that extremely seriously if someone wants to be an active father and they can't be as close to their children as they'd like. At the same time, there is a way in which it's an extremely adult-centred version of trying to give expression to those needs that we've ended up with. And there's a sort of way of dividing children all the time that seems to be centred on adults' rights rather than on a discourse about children.
Interesting. I've got a question over this side.
Oh, you actually stimulated it. The only reason I got up is because I didn't think anyone else was going to, and I wanted to ask the question.
Good on you. I think we should give her a little clap. Thank you.
And my question was going to be centred around this issue of, what about the women who don't have children and who can't find a means to have children, i.e. a man in the gay capital of the world, which is Sydney, and are 40.
This isn't a dating site.
And my number
But she's gorgeous.
but we can provide a link to a dating site.
Sorry to interrupt you, go on.
No, so Sue, you actually stimulated the conversation and sort of raised the thing that I was going to ask Anne to talk about. But while I was standing here thinking about another topic to bring up, since I was standing up anyway, I kind of thought it kind of linked back to one of the topics this morning. I don't know if anyone in the audience went to see, what's his name? Eric Hoffman this morning, about how the threat's the wrong word, but he was talking about the demise of Western secularism because people are moving to religion and people are creating, people are moving towards fundamentalist religion and having many, many more children. And one of the things that I thought they didn't touch on then was, wow, maybe people are moving to this more religious way of life because there is this massive hole and this massive gap in consumerist capitalism for your soul. And I think one of the risks, and you correctly said, Anne, I'm going around in circles a bit here, but there is a point, and I'm getting there. You correctly said even the topic here, are children worth it? It's almost couched in a way that doesn't taste good when you swallow it. It's, all of a sudden everything in the Western world is about, well, what's it worth? What can it get for me? What's the value? And I think one of the challenges we have as as men and women, when we're wanting now to have everything, we're wanting to work, we're wanting to have our children, is we have to make sure we're bringing them into an environment where we do have the time for them, and where we do have an experience where we have children where it is worth it for children and adults. And I just despair sometimes that everything these days is just about money, 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 money. And we even have to talk about the issue of children in the context of, well, is it worth it to have kids or not? And this whole issue of worth, I think, in Western capitalist, consumerist, increasingly American societies just has to be recalibrated, because it's not just about money anymore.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting whenever people talk about what their children mean to them. I'm reminded of a social theorist called Zygmunt Bauman, and he's got this lovely line, which is, he said, "Love is incoherent in the court of reason." And what he means is, it's very hard actually to articulate when someone else is sort of listing all these things of money and, you know, the loss of opportunity and all the rest of it, of what it is to have that profound intimacy with another human being, that it is to have them feeding from your body, to have that sensuality of the early child-mother relationship, to have a father who feels that this child is more valuable than his own life. It's very hard to articulate all of those things without, in this rather hard-nosed world, sounding sentimentalised and sounding rather soppy. But it's interesting that whenever people go to talk about the value of children, they immediately go out of every cost-benefit analysis and move towards things of intrinsic meaning. And that's actually been, I think, the corruption of the private sphere by those values, the colonisation of the private sphere by those values, which means that we are, you know, incoherent in the court of reason, and cost-benefit analysis you couldn't get more of a court of reason than that, you know.
Good. Over this side.
Hi, first of all, I just wanted to say thank you for that inspiring and very heartfelt talk.
Can you just speak up a little?
Thank you very much for that heartfelt and inspiring talk. I felt very moved by what you had to say. It was also really informative, and I've been looking, I'm a mum now and I've got a son of 3 years, and it's been really important to me to understand more about parenting. Even though I've been an academic and in education for 20 years, when my son was born, it was like, it's a whole different ball game to take care of someone emotionally, psychologically, cognitively. So I did start doing a lot of reading, and I've been seeing so much at the extremes, like you say, everything from the helicopter parent right through to the free-range child. And I think I wanted to ask you, with your wealth of experience, how do you get back to that centre, if you know what I mean, about good parenting that doesn't have to be at any extreme, and how do you find that? Yeah, how do you find it? Do you know what I mean by the question?
Well, I do. I have to say that when I became a parent, my instinct was to not read much. I really didn't read much parenting literature at all. I had one book, which was Penelope Leach, which was really helpful to know how to get soap out of a child's eye. But I just thought, bugger it. I'm 55. You want to make an issue of it? No. No, you can also tell people if it was Benjamin Spock. They're even more ancient than me. But essentially, now they've got the Contented Little Parent book. No, I think I've got that wrong. Contented Little Baby book. But it means the same thing. It's all about how to make a baby easier. But no, I didn't read a lot. I didn't read a lot because I had one friend who said she'd studied to be a mother, and I couldn't work it out, but I just knew. I thought, no, you're not going to study to be a mother. So I think some things are helpful, but I tell you what I did learn from, and that was observing other mothers, observing fathers, and seeing what I liked about the way they handled children, especially those who had older children who'd, been around the traps. And so I learnt from that and from observation. But I tell you the other thing I thought was really helpful was I had a lot of animals growing up. And, no, it's true, that because animals, you get into a dialogue with them and it's non-verbal. You're always reading non-verbal communication, and actually baby is non-verbal. So you're looking for the language of gesture, and I think it's a lot easier. I think a lot of people have lives that are very remote from children, especially if you're in families where you're the youngest or there's been one child. I know there was Barry Brazelton came out and he was talking about how you should do this and do that, and I just felt it was exhausting. You had to sit down, there was mat time, and then you stood up, and then you did, so it was all kind of, it was a kind of parenting calculus, as to how you did it. And I'll say no one like that's ever been with a baby. He writes about them, he's famous, he's very rich, but because of his writing, but nonetheless, the kind of moment-to-moment being with a child. And in that same context, I'd say this business of being a good mother, being a good father, how static is that concept? Just think about being good to the person, and you'll know that in daily ways you live and fail that. You gain it and you fail it. But the actual idea of this identity called, awarded by some committee of the good mother or the good father, that are completely unhelpful because it is a static, rigid thing. Rather, think about simply being good to someone. That's active. That's an active thing.
That's great. We'll have time for one more question, and you better make it worth it.
I'll try. When you started, you were quite critical, and this will relate to the last question actually. You were quite critical of this current trend of speaking about the difficulties of parenthood loud, talking about it in negative terms. And you were also quite critical of what you called, and I agree with you on this point to a certain extent, good old days when children didn't have that many rights as they do today. But I think the truth lies somewhere in between as well, and I wonder what are your thoughts about the current parenting practices of the middle class, which I would argue are quite often child-centric, to the extent that it didn't used to be in the past. So I would love to hear anything that you have to say on this.
A little bit like the question about helicopter parenting, I think.
Are you saying about the, could we go too far in child-centeredness?
Absolutely, and I actually think that this trend of the blogging and the articles and starting to speak out a bit more about the difficulties of parenthood is actually in a way quite helpful, not because we need to go to the bed at the good old days, but because I think it may bring us a little bit towards the middle. Because I think talking about what is to be good parent and how actually non-static concept it is, in some ways we might be putting a lot of pressure on the parents, not just in terms of the state, but also in terms of the standards of what is quality of parenting. And children almost become like our bodies these days, children as a project rather than as it used to be. So I would love to hear about this.
Yes. Well, yeah. I mean, we shouldn't look at children like a mining engineer looks at a landscape, how to develop them. I mean, I think that there is something which is far too overheated about the cultivation of children, and that goes back to that kind of achievement ethos which penetrates parenting. But I also think I now have 2 adult children, and I think we should, one of the reasons why you cannot do a cost-benefit analysis is because it's simply a kind of adventure, and it's a kind of mystery. And it may end badly for you. Although there is a reasonable correlation between how you behave as a parent and what happens later on, it's not really all that assured. So there's a kind of humility we should have, I suppose, in engaging in that task. And so all the kind of efforts to centre too much on children, well, I partly agree with them in the sense that it's different to think of children having rights to spending all your time focused in child-centred time, because children should be able to cope with adults having conversations and being a part of the world as opposed to simply the centre of the world all the time. And there is something almost like the omnipotent parent which is out there as well, which is, that by pulling this lever later on, the Harvard exit door will come up and in they'll go. And it's really not that simple and it's not that easy. So I think there's definitely something in what you say. I'm just contrasting it against the idea of the free range parenting, which again I actually found had some really attractive ideas in it, at the same time as recognising that parents can't be blamed if they're in suburbs where sociologists write a book called Nobody's Home, and they feel uncomfortable about free-range parenting. So somehow the context has really changed enormously for parents, and they can't always, get that, maybe the kind of freedom that people had from an older era. And we can't idealise that either, because that freedom came from a lot of mothers making sacrifices.
Thanks, Anne. Very nice. Thank you all for coming, and enjoy the festival.